All right, welcome to this explainer on Alice Walker's absolutely gut-wrenching short story, Strong Horse Tea. If you've got a literature exam coming up on this, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're going to break down those massive themes of desperation and systemic indifference and really dig into the core character traits that drive this whole tragedy. So, let's jump right in.
Here's a quick look at our study guide agenda for today. We'll be covering the tragic premise, Ronnie's desperation, the mailman's indifference, Aunt Sarah's realism, key symbols, and finally, the big question of who is to blame.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the tragic premise, focusing on this desperate setting. Notice the very specific language Walker uses right from the jump. Rannie's baby, Snooks, is dying from double pneumonia and whooping cough, and Walker describes this sick little baby as making a grave-like mound in the bed. If you're writing an essay, you absolutely want to point out how this visceral language instantly creates an atmosphere of extreme poverty and just impending tragedy. This incredibly harsh environment totally isolates Rannie, and it shapes her main character trait throughout the story, which is this terrifying vulnerability. I mean, the cold wind is literally shooting through the cracks in her house, the rain is flooding the muddy yard, she is completely dependent on outside help that, as we'll see, just isn't coming. Moving on to Section 2, Rannie Toomer, Desperation and Belief. Rannie's psychological shift in this story is profound. It's a real focal point. She starts off with this naive but fierce trust in the modern white world. She completely rejects Aunt Sarah's traditional swamp magic and home remedies, right? She genuinely believes that if she just plays by the rules and begs the white mailman for a real doctor, society's gonna step in and save her baby. She even asks who'd go and ignore a little sick baby like my Snooks. But man, as Aunt Sarah reveals that the doctor was actually never called, Rannie's entire worldview just shatters. Her dominant trait shifts from this misplaced faith to sheer heartbreaking desperation. She literally devolves to the point where she's willing to catch horse urine in the freezing mud just for a fraction of a chance at saving her son. Let's look at Section 3, the mailman, representing indifference and racism. Think about the immense cultural divide between these two characters. You've got the mailman standing there in his crisp, dry tweed coat, a walking symbol of oblivious privilege, and then you have Rannie in her flooded, dilapidated house representing sheer survival. This guy is literally her only bridge to the outside world, to the town, to modern medicine. But instead of real help, he brings her these glossy circulars advertising stuff she could never, ever afford, like cold creams and hair dryers. She actually ends up using them to paper her walls just to keep the freezing wind out. It's a stark divide that perfectly highlights how totally disconnected the establishment is from Rannie's brutal reality.
For your exam, you definitely want to pay close attention to this juxtaposition. What the mailman politely says to Ronnie is the complete opposite of what he's actually thinking. His defining character trait is this performative politeness that just barely masks his casual bigotry. He flashes her this big, friendly smile and says, "We'll do what we can." But internally, he is totally repulsed by her. He recoils from her breath. He literally thinks she smells like a wet goat. And he's just fundamentally annoyed by her begging, wondering why folks like her always want him to do something for them. He doesn't harm her by hitting her. He harms her with his apathy. He simply fails to pass on a life or death message to the doctor.
All right, Section 4, Aunt Sarah and her grounded realism. Here we see a massive clash of beliefs. Rannie's desperate hope for inclusion in modern society crashes head-on into Aunt Sarah's pragmatic survivalism. Sarah wears magic leaves sewn in possum skin. She relies entirely on what she can actually control within her own marginalized community. While Rannie is begging for the shots that makes people's well, Sarah is deeply, deeply skeptical of the white society that Rannie has put all her faith in. Sarah knows from bitter, lived experience that they are entirely on their own. And that skepticism builds into one of the absolute most important quotes in the text. Sarah chants white mailman, white doctor, which perfectly captures her profound awareness that the establishment is ultimately going to ignore a sick black baby. When Ronnie innocently asks who would ignore a dying child, Sarah shoots back, "Some folks we don't know so well as we thinks we do, might." She understands the brutal limits of their world, and she's trying to prepare Ronnie for the devastating reality that this doctor is never, ever going to show up. Which brings us to Section 5, key symbols: the storm, the mud, and the horse. Okay, you will absolutely want to memorize these key symbols for your test, and exactly what they represent about Rannie's internal struggle and her external entrapment. First up, the storm. All that thunder and lightning represents both Rannie's chaotic internal turmoil and the external, uncontrollable forces of fate that are just actively working against her. Second, we have the mud. Rannie's slipping and sliding in that thick mud, that symbolizes the inescapable trap of poverty. No matter how hard she tries to run toward a solution, her environment just pulls her right back down. And finally, the gray mare, the horse itself. The horse represents a brutal, base reality. When modern society completely fails her, Rannie is reduced to seeking salvation from the lowest, dirtiest elements of nature. And finally, Section 6, the synthesis climax. Who is to blame? So for your exam, you really need to critically engage with this one big question. Who is actually to blame for Snook's death? Are we looking at a failure of individuals here, or a massive failure of society? You'll need to evaluate the textual evidence and decide, does this tragedy stem from individual flaws, or does it point to an uncaring systemic problem? I mean, sure, you could argue the mailman is individually to blame because he's the one who didn't deliver the message, but Walker's text strongly leans toward a systemic critique. The mailman's indifference isn't just one bad apple, it's a direct reflection of a society that isolates marginalized people, completely denies them resources, sends them useless junk mail instead of actual help, and just views their suffering as a minor annoyance. So poverty, racism, and lack of access, those are the true antagonists here. And that brings us to the end. The story leaves us with this incredibly visceral, devastating reveal. We see Rannie out in the freezing rain, desperately catching horse urine in her cracked, cheap plastic shoe, eagerly planning to run it back inside to her son. But meanwhile, inside that house, the thunder completely masks the exact moment Snook's frail breathing stops forever. The tragedy is just absolute. Her total desperation led her to abandon every shred of her pride, only to find out it was already too late. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to really ponder for your exam. How exactly does this tragic final image solidify Walker's themes of systemic indifference? Think about what it truly means that a mother is pushed to such humiliating, primal lengths simply because the modern world absolutely refused to acknowledge her existence. Good luck studying!